Remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. But why is that night in 1605 so important for us to remember?
Well, in order to understand the importance of this night, we need to rewind to the Tudors before King James I, when tension was rising through so many changes.
In the 16th century, religion, politics and the monarchy were the key to governing England, but sometimes it became a matter of life and death. Henry VIII, of course, caused huge religious uproar with his changes, and after Cranmer wrote the Book of Common Prayer, England was made a Protestant state. Mary I was determined to take us back to a Catholic state, and then Elizabeth I went back to Protestant. So all the religious changes and tension that the Tudors brought meant that eventually it was made high treason for a Catholic priest to even enter England. This meant that priest hunters came about, and they had to hunt down those priests. I'm currently hiding from those hunters in a priest hole.
These were often built in fireplaces or attics, mostly between 1550 and 1605, which is when the gunpowder plot took place, which you can experience in immersive theatre, which is where I am. Don't worry, I'm not in a real priest hole. Sometimes they would have to hide for days and could die from lack of oxygen, and some hunters might even pretend to leave to draw the priests out so they could grab them as they ran. One of the most skilled builders of these priest holes was Nicholas Owen, who built a series of safe houses in the 1590s. And he engineered the escape of the Jesuit father John Gerard from the Tower of London in 1597.
After Elizabeth I's reign, where she treated Catholics awfully, James I was their little bit of hope for some kindness. But the Catholics were wrong. He condemned Catholicism. Now, there were already loads of plots against him, but the one we know today started in May of 1604.
Robert Catesby proposed the plan to a group of 4 others, Guy Fawkes, Tom Winter, Jack Wright and Thomas Percy, at the Duck and Drake Inn in London. They swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book, and 8 men joined in later, which is when it becomes the gunpowder plot. But on the 26th of October, an anonymous letter is sent that alerts the authorities, so Guy Fawkes is found at midnight on the 4th of November in a cellar with a pocket of matches surrounded by gunpowder.
But which of those 13 men wrote the silly letter that ruined Guy Fawkes' night? Well, I guess you'd have to find out at the gunpowder plot.
Or, spoiler alert, it was Francis Tresham. He had been involved in many Catholic plots against the state before, so it's surprising that he was the one to give away this. He wrote the Monteagle letter, a cryptic letter only intended to warn his brother-in-law, Lord Monteagle, who sadly blabbed. But it wasn't until at least a week later that Tresham was taken to the Tower of London, after Guy Fawkes had his time on the rack, meaning he named some of the other people as part of the powder treason. But more on the other 13 men tomorrow. Have you ever wondered who the 13 unlucky men involved in the gunpowder plot were? Or rather, who were the people behind Bonfire Night? Of course, you all know Guy Fawkes, but he wasn't the ringleader. Robert Catesby was the man who proposed the plot in May of 1604. Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby met Tom Winter, Jack Wright and Thomas Percy in the Duck and Drake Inn in London in May 1604, which is where they proposed the plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and all 5 of these men supposedly swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. 8 other men join in later, which is when it becomes the gunpowder plot, but it's also where it all goes downhill because that means there's 13, and we all know 13's an unlucky number. We'll start with Guy because we all know him, but he referred to himself actually as Guido. He started working under the alias of John Johnson in a cellar just underneath the House of Lords, which is where the plotters had started stockpiling gunpowder. The new session of Parliament opened on the 5th of November, so the plan was that Fawkes would light the match in the cellar on that day. The plan was that this would blow up the House of Lords, the House of Commons, King James and his son. Guy Fawkes would escape on a boat across the Thames, and the other plotters would start a revolt in the Midlands. They would kidnap James's daughter Elizabeth, make her a puppet queen, marry her to a Catholic and restore a Catholic monarchy. Of course, none of that happens because of an anonymous letter sent by Francis Tresham. When Guy Fawkes was arrested, Catesby along with the Wright brothers escaped up north to try and gather support. On Thursday, the 7th of November, Catesby and a load of the other plotters ended up in a fight to the death against the High Sheriff of Worcestershire. Catesby and Thomas Percy were stood together with their swords just outside the front of the house they were staying or hiding in, and they were shot by a sniper through the trees. His head could then be found on a spike at London Bridge. 4 of the other conspirators were imprisoned at the Tower of London. They were then tied to a horse and dragged through the crowded streets to St Paul's Churchyard, which is where they were hung, drawn and quartered. Those 4 men were Sir Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant and Thomas Bates. Francis Tresham you know from yesterday's video, but he exposed the whole plot by sending a letter to his brother-in-law saying, "Don't go to Parliament on the opening of Parliament, save yourself," and he ends up dying in the Tower of London. Ambrose Rookwood had organised the escape plan for the plotters after the event, but in January 1606 he was tried and found guilty, also dragged through the streets of London to the site of his execution, but instead of hung, drawn and quartered, he was strangled and butchered on a scaffold in front of a large crowd. Robert's brother Thomas Wintour was also hung, drawn and quartered, but Robert happened the first day, and then Thomas, Wintour, Rookwood, Keyes and Fawkes were hung, drawn and quartered the day after. Robert Keyes possibly suffered the most painful execution, so as he was stepping onto the scaffolding with the rope around his neck, he suddenly leapt off the gallows in the hopes that it would snap his neck quicker, so it would just be over, done with, but instead the rope snapped, he just crashed onto the floor, but was still conscious and was taken straight to the quartering block instead, fully aware that he was being or about to be chopped up. And Christopher and John Wright were actually related to Thomas Percy, who was their brother-in-law, so they were all in on the plot, having previously been involved in a plot against Elizabeth I, but they also died in the Battle of Holsbeach, which was where Catesby and Percy were shot. John Wright was shot and died there and then, whereas Christopher was shot a few days after. And that is the men involved in the Gunpowder Plot and how they died.